there's a lot of smart people working on this, and it's going to take an entire industry. But don't forget about the controllables. Giving the gilts a good place to live, fresh feet, clean water, good environment, doesn't take anything too fancy, and make sure we just take care of her the best we can. Watch the feed budgets, watch the barn, watch the stocking density. We know the things that have an impact. We can control those. Let's don't forget about them.
Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Kyle Coble, who's the Director of Nutrition Services for JBS. Kyle, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Laura. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're glad to have you on today, Kyle. Before we talk about our subject tonight, I would really like for you to take a moment and talk a little bit more about yourself and your background, because some of our audience members may not be as familiar with you as others.
Sure. Well, it's a privilege to be on. I've had an exciting career, this soon into it. I grew up in South Central Kansas, just south of Wichita, the grandson of a veterinarian who started one of the first feedlots in Kansas, and was really raised more with a cattle background. But I always had a passion for pigs and got into the show pig world, which many of us in the swine industry, it's been a little bit of the gateway drug into this industry. Got into 4-H and FFA, and ultimately went to undergrad at Oklahoma State, where I was a student worker at the swine farm and had some management responsibilities there under Kim Brock, who is one of the biggest mentors in my life. Felt like I didn't know enough to be of any value to anyone. And so, and was really interested on the nutrition side. Dr. Scott Carter there was doing a lot of things on the nutrient excretion side. That farm was only about 3 or 4 years old. And so it was really humming with a lot of excitement on campus. Stayed there for a master's, did some work in nutrient excretion, specifically looking at gas emissions in nutrient excretion with ractopamine, and worked with Dr. Keith Hayden and Megan Pearden during their tenureship at Elanco, and also worked on a few antibiotic alternative trials that Megan Bible, who's with Hamlet Protein, did. Again, I felt like I was of no value to anyone at the end of that yet, and was fortunate enough to go on to Kansas State University for a PhD, and I studied under that crew there, and under the advisement of Joel DeRushi, Mike Tokesh, and Steve Drees. When I was there, really focused on finishing production, specifically high fiber ingredients and byproduct ingredients, and then also feeding copper. Did a lot of work with James Usry on tribasic copper chloride, and really trying to understand some of the intricacies and the mode of action. I made the mistake early in my tenureship of my PhD, though. I told Dr. DeRushi that I was bored, and he quickly found me a job with Chad Hasted at New Fashion Pork, and was fortunate to run the research there for pretty much my entirety of my PhD program at K-State. I was responsible for the research program there at New Fashion Pork, helped build a couple of barns, and that led into a full-time job. Moved from Manhattan to near Jackson, Minnesota. My responsibilities there was to continue on the research front. And we were, in that time, we were doing anywhere between 30 and 40 trials a year of various things. But also got the unique responsibility to, in addition to some nutrition, really work on pig flow and marketing. And I developed a passion for that. I was really interested in that, and understanding how to run that operation. I think pig flow is one of the hardest jobs in production, and Dr. Frecking was very, very giving with his time, and what I call industrial or industry tuition. He allowed some tuition costs there for me to learn. I also had the opportunity to start up a GAP certified production system that they call Old Fashioned Pork. And it's a 1,400 head sow operation there in South Central Wisconsin. and was fortunate enough to lead that effort. Got the call from Dr. Turner that JBS had purchased Cargill in middle to early of 2017. And it was a unique opportunity, and I was a little bit hesitant. It's quite a bit bigger system, and wasn't quite sure it was a good fit. And after about 8 or 9 months of milling it over, I ultimately made the leap to start the nutritional services division of JBS Live Pork, and have been here since 2018. So it's 5 years here this past Sunday. So it's where I'm at today. I lead the nutrition team here. I also lead the feed milling team and the research team. So that's my background, Laura.
Yeah, you have quite a full background and a busy job as it is in the moment, for sure. Well, Kyle, we were visiting a little bit beforehand, and one of the topics that I think would be really good to visit on today is about sow longevity and some of the things that you're exploring and considering there at JBS, or maybe outside of JBS, on things that we can do to improve sow livability. And so I think we'll just kind of start with is just let you generally talk a little bit about what are you doing and what are your thoughts? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about maybe some of the research that you've done more recently.
Yeah, I think the sow mortality and sow longevity discussion continues to be at the forefront of what we talk about nearly every day in our system. And I know that we're no different than others. The cost of a sow and a gilt is very, very expensive, and the cost of maintaining her is expensive. And it's a challenge. And I would say as an industry, we have a problem. But there's so many smart people working on it that this is a very complex, multifaceted issue that's certainly not going to be fixed with one silver bullet. A lot of what we've been working on, at least within the JBS system, is really kind of two-tiered. Like a lot of production systems, we don't have a ton of intensely managed research space on the sow side. So it's very, very hard to really get nitty-gritty with a really cute nutritional intervention or plan on the sow side, because it just takes so much to manage it. And then the numbers to get any sort of repeatability of scale really inhibits a lot of those challenges. But what we've tried to do is take an idea and create a pilot that was at least big enough in size that we wouldn't run down a dark path, but yet small enough in scope that we could handle it and it wasn't a huge burden. And we've done that with, on the first project in this area, is partnering with the University of Arkansas, with Dr. Charlie Maxwell and Dr. TC, and working with PIC and DSM. And the first question we wanted to answer was, can we nutritionally manipulate the growth of gilts and have an impact on longevity? I firmly believe that the gilt is where this starts, and so many gilts across every business and system get stuck in a finisher at 15 pounds, and we turn the timer on and let them grow, and then try to pull them out as close to 300 or 310 pounds as possible to put them in a sow farm. So what we did was say, hey, we had been finding a lot of OCD in these older gilts. And the lameness was really a big discussion point. So OCD is typically an impact of really fast growing animals. So that's what led us down this path of saying, well, let's maybe try to manipulate the gilt growth. So we put 160 gilts on feed from 50 pounds forward, and followed them through their entire gilt production and sow production through 4 parities. And just now wrapping that up, and interesting enough, the gilts ate a lot more than we thought they would. We tried to reduce growth close to 10%, and it was a challenge to do that. to get the lysine level low enough to where we thought we could get the growth suppressed in late finishing, and then also get the amino acids to still balance out when you don't have any added lysine in some of those diets, and especially with the high level of byproducts. And then what was interesting second from that is the compensatory growth that they had during gestation was really interesting. That when it became time to come into the farrowing house, at least on that first initial group, there wasn't a huge difference in weight. They had compensated. But essentially, we were turning off the treatments at the time they come into the sow farm to be flushed as a female and be bred. So it wasn't a total surprise, but how quickly they compensated was very interesting. So we fast forward through all these parities, and what we found was sows that had been on the lower energy rations had somewhere between a 15 and a 20% improvement in retention over that number of parities. The other thing that was really interesting was the gilts and sows who had been fed the lower energy rations had a higher lactation intake. Whether it's gastric distension, which there's a group that doesn't believe in that, and there's a group that maybe thinks that it is, and I'm not sure where I find myself. But does that come into play? But we did have a higher intake and a little bit of improvement in total born. So fully understanding that, 160 females through those number of parities is not as large of a study as we would like. We further went on and started 3,300 gilts on the same treatments. And those gilts are just now getting bred in Dalhart, Texas, as a part of this second larger project. So, as with any of these longevity/gilt trials, it just takes a lot of time. And I think the industry is somewhat running out of patience. I know our production system is for some sort of breathing room or some sort of answer that just at least stops the bleeding, no pun intended. And these things just take time. So those are kind of the two main projects that we've worked on. We've certainly went ahead and put some of this in the field and implemented it. The OCD was getting so bad in some of these that, the number of females that we could keep going into the farm was being severely impacted. It was definitely a time for me to bond with the veterinarian, with Dr. Darren Madsen, him and I, and actually John Bergstrom at DSM. We spent an entire day in the field and just cut open pigs. And this was something I felt like I could help with. It's hard to regulate intake and growth on ad libitum feeders, but I felt like this was something that, nutrition and health sciences kind of came together. And so when we put this in the field, I am happy to report that the OCD incidences have very much diminished. So that's kind of the main focus that we've been working on at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's really good. And I have a question there, but before we do, I'm going to just stop for a moment and communicate to the audience. If you're not familiar with what Kyle is saying for OCD, that's osteochondrosis. So it's degradation of the bone at the joint level. And so if we open up a joint, we'll see a lesion. And we believe that is, of course, just destruction from inflammation and cytokines from just rapid growth. So just for some people that may not be familiar with that term, that's what he's referring to. But Kyle, I want to back up a moment because you talked about you were reducing energy. So by reducing energy, we actually reduce the lysine that's also going in that feed. But then you made a comment about by the time they went to farrowing, they were of the same weight. So my question to you is, did you breed them at different weights then as their first farrowing, as their first gilt, or did you wait until those gilts essentially grew to the appropriate weight and then you bred them to match their counterparts?
Yeah, no, we did everything based on time.
Okay.
And so, these gilts would have been, essentially we tried to mimic the flow of a female into a sow farm coming in, getting flush fed, and going through, the whole H&S cycle and then being bred, we tried to mimic that just based on timing. And so they were of the same age at the time of breeding.
That's very good. So that'll be interesting to see what your larger group will tell, and hopefully that does give us some additional information. So that, can you give us maybe an idea of how much difference in weight those two groups might have been at the same age?
Yeah, we were only able to capture about somewhere between 7 and 9 kilograms on average. So, we're talking 15 pounds or so, 15 to 18 pounds difference on kind of the average. But on the extremes, there were some, that were definitely a little more outside of that. On the group that we did 3,300, when we weighed them off test at about or at least out of the research barn and on their way to an isolation barn in order to be introduced to the Dalhart population. When we weighed individually those 3,300, the average doesn't sound like it changed much. But when we look at the distribution of those gilts, what we did was those high, extremely fast-growing gilts, we essentially pulled them down and made the distribution tighter. So it wasn't that we really impacted the bottom end of the gilts. It was more so that we really kind of capped those really fast-growing, somewhat earlier maturing gilts. We kind of held them back a little bit. So you see more of a peak than a hill when we're looking at the control compared to this lower energy. And in that instance, the control would have been a corn soy-based ration in terms of energy level to relate to what others may be doing.
Yeah, that's really intriguing. So Kyle, one of the other things that I'm really curious about here is some of maybe the other work you've been doing on parity and conversations around that. So you had mentioned to me a little bit earlier that you've been kind of tracking those parities and looking at some differences, and maybe you're not able to share that. Maybe that's still in research mode, but if you're willing, I think that'd be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, so I'd ask you about parity in terms of kind of what we're seeing for sow mortality in some of these parities.
Yeah.
When we look at the analysis, certainly, these P1, P2s are dying at a higher rate or being removed from the herd at a higher rate than what they had. And I think that makes a little bit of sense, right? Because the sows who have the ability to make it to P4, 5, 6, and 7, get through that initial parity a lot sooner. And definitely it hones us in on what are we doing with the gilt and that immediate time right after she farrows and into her start of her second gestation. We are monitoring gilt weights probably as closely as we ever have. PJ Corns is our sow director, and he and I talk several times a day on a variety of topics. But one of the things that we focus on, and I would say probably 20 to 30% of the conversations that I have are all about sow condition. And I am very fortunate to work with a sow production manager who gets it. And I think I'm pretty lucky because, we give a protocol of, we want to feed 4 pounds and this is enough energy to maintain her in condition. And, we may debate about that initially, but then we just really debate about the execution. And yes, we know sows are dying. Yes, we know that lameness can be a problem. Yes, we know prolapses are happening. But those things aren't in our immediate control today. What can we control today? We can control gilt weights going in. We can monitor their growth. So when I'm on sow farms that have a GDU, we'll weigh, maybe 10 pigs kind of in every group, and we'll look at a lifetime average daily gain, trying to, get somewhere between 650 and 700 grams per day of lifetime gain. And then we'll look at that and show that to the farm that, hey, the gilts are on track, or hey, the gilts are not on track. Is there a production or a management or a nutritional intervention that needs to go on? but it's really focusing on those controllables, and those initial parities gives us that longer longevity later on. And keeping those sows in condition as well. Sometimes you've got to push some feed, and certainly, when you're on farm today, a lot of conversations that you have with folks is the price of feed, right? But we also know when we get a sow too heavy or get her too thin, there's a huge cost with that. So, we try to not let, we don't want to skip over the dollars to save a few pennies. We want to make sure we're using that feed appropriately, but we're not going to get, into these 30 plus PSYs unless we have her in that condition. And we know throughput drives a lot of costs down. And sometimes, you have to put a few more inputs to get that. So that's how we're kind of focusing on things. Those initial parities are so important to her life. And the goal is to get that gilt at the right weight in the farm, get her in the right condition, and keep her there. I was at a farm today, a nucleus farm actually, who historically had a challenge with heavy gilts. It was not uncommon to have 350 plus gilts, and it was just an artifact of those gilts just did really, really well in that GDU. But over time, with some management and the team there got focused on it, they got the condition off those gilts over time in the appropriate way, and looking at sow condition and looking at how those sows come out of farrowing, they were just beautiful. And you look at the sow mortality on that farm, and it's definitely one of the lower ones. So there's some things that we can control. And I think folks certainly listening to this we've got a lot to learn on sow mortality, but there's so much that we already know that can really help drive this. Gilt weights and sow condition are a big part of that.
Uh-huh. You mentioned that you're routinely checking the gilt developers and making sure that your gilts are growing at a set level per day. So I have 650 to 700 grams in my notes. Are you making any selections based off that? Are you saying, well, if they're under this level, we won't keep them? Or is it more, no, this is just a visual. If at this age, they're at the bottom portion of the curve, they're just going to be culled from the herd?
Yeah. That's a world I would love to live in. With the recent, I shouldn't say recent, but with the uptick in PRRS outbreaks, gilts that have 4 legs and have a functional underline and a good reproductive tract are a hot commodity. And which I think plays into part of our problem. Our selection pressure has really had to be dialed down because we need all the gilts that we can get. But if I could step out of my reality for a minute and live in a different world, I think that we would. And certainly, those gilts that are faster growing are just going to be big at the time of breeding. And if we're able to not utilize those, send those to a cull market, maybe with your cull sows, I think that'd be definitely a great way to do that. I don't know if you could ever be too gilt rich, if you will. We always need more gilts. But I think that would be a great process. Now, could you financially afford that? And if this population, if you only need to peel off the top 3 or 4%, and that translated into half the sow mortality due to lameness, if we may, kind of cowboy math seems like that'd probably be a pretty good investment, because we're not continuing on to have some of that mortality. But you also have to balance it with, I need to get a litter out of this expensive gilt that I've just raised to this point. What is that break even? The financials have to come back into this at some point. I would just like to mention, though, too, that I think as an industry, I would challenge what a GDU or a gilt finisher, if you will, looks like today. As many herd closures as we've had due to PRRS, as many flow changes that we've had due to geography with PRRS moving into that, has caused us to make some difficult decisions of what to do with her. It seems like some of these gilts, we've called them gypsies because they've moved around to try to skirt these animal health challenges in efforts to do the right thing with them. But ultimately, they don't make a great gilt at the end. And, should we be considering more a different type of feeding system in these gilt barns? So that way, if we do have to have a herd closure that causes us to do an offsite breeding project with these gilts, feeding ad libitum gilts is it's just a recipe for a challenge down the road. And, should we be putting more feed boxes, even just feed drops like a gestation feed drop in finishers with smaller stanchions to be able to control growth? A lot of the work in Brazil, out of Bortoloza's group and a few others, has looked at this controlled feeding of gilts. And I think there's something there, if nonetheless, to be able to do an offsite breeding project so these gilts can really have a normal life cycle, if you will. I think it would be a great place. We certainly don't have any, but I would love it if someone would show us how that should be done.
I think that's a great suggestion, Kyle. Well, one of the last things I want to talk about here is, it would be remiss if I didn't bring up the word prolapse if we're talking about livability. And so any observations that you've noticed in your system that you'd like to share with others in terms of prolapses and how that relates to your sow retention?
Yes. Prolapses is the other thing that we talk about a lot. And prolapses are just such a challenge to really clearly identify some root causes. And PIC has done some work. I know the Iowa State group has done as much work as anybody on this. And we have put a task force together within our system to really focus in on this and look at some things. So a couple of things that I would like to mention here, Dr. Greiner, is the first one was mycotoxins come to mind, and nearly 75 to 80% of the nutritional discussions, mycotoxins come into play. And we were asked to say, hey, you guys do all this mycotoxin testing in all of these feed mills. You have this vast database. Have you ever looked at it? And a production manager by the name of Carl Bray, he's one of our production managers, he challenged me to say, have you ever done anything with that data? Have you laid it over any type of this stuff? And I felt a little remiss that, no, actually I haven't. That's a great idea. So we laid all of our mycotoxin data over the last 2 years of our deaths due to prolapse, and we could not find a correlation. Oddly enough, and I'm not saying that this is how it is, but actually when we had a little higher zearalenone, the prolapse rate went down. So I'm not campaigning that everyone just needs to feed crummy corn, but out of the 3,000 plus analysis and over 100,000 records over 2 years of sows, it was clear to us that that conversation probably can die down quite a bit. There's certainly times when we think that could be a player, but when Dr. Madsen and I have looked in the literature, we think of zearalenone because of an estrogen type of molecule that can be associated with zearalenone. In some human studies, higher levels of estrogen has actually been associated with lower levels of prolapses on the human side of things. Estrogen's pretty important from a vesicular integrity standpoint, repairing the reproductive tissue. So I don't think that we should be extremely scared of estrogen in some of their compounds. We have partnered with Colorado State University, and I don't want to do a spoiler alert on a project, but we have partnered with Colorado State University to look at some estrogen in our feed, to just start to rule some of these things out so that the conversations can start to take a little bit of a different direction. And lastly, a graduate student by the name of Jared Harshman, who is at Oklahoma State University, is doing a project looking at serum mineral levels and things like collagen and relaxin and estrogen. And he's going to be on your guys' podcast here, I think sometime in the next week or two. I don't want to steal his thunder.
No, wonderful. We'll keep our eyes out for that one for sure. Well, Kyle, our time is really kind of wrapping up, and I know we could probably talk a lot longer on some of your experiences and what you're doing to work on sow survivability. But we do need to wrap it up. And so what I would ask for you to do is maybe share a couple of key tips or suggestions that you would like our audience to take away from our conversation today.
Yeah, I think, if I could summarize that up, There's a lot of smart people working on this, and it's going to take an entire industry. But don't forget about the controllables. Giving the gilts a good place to live, fresh feet, clean water, good environment. Doesn't take anything too fancy, and make sure we just take care of her the best we can. Watch the feed budgets. Watch the barn. Watch the stocking density. We know the things that have an impact. We can control those. Let's don't forget about them.
Very good.
It's time for our famous three.
Well, Kyle, one of the things we like to do with our guests as we wrap up is ask you a couple of questions. The first one we'd like to ask you is, do you have a swine resource that you'd recommend to the audience?
Yeah, for me, I go to, definitely the NRC is a huge part of what we rely on. But I also like the old Blue Lee Southern book, the Swine Nutrition book that was published several years back. I still think it has a lot of the fundamentals. And sometimes we get so wrapped up in what's new and interesting that sometimes I just like to go back and read a chapter just to refresh myself to make sure that I'm on the straight and narrow. And I think sometimes it's okay to do that. So those are kind of my two main resources to go to. There's definitely always the K-State Swine Days. There's a ton of information in there that I don't know what I'd do without.
Yeah, absolutely. All very good swine resource books. How about something that's not related to pigs? Is there anything that you're reading currently or have read that you might recommend to the group?
Yeah, you had a gentleman at your Iowa State Swine Days named Peter Zion who came and spoke. And I think he's a great teacher, and he has a unique perspective on the world. His first book, The Accidental Superpower, is a great one. And I think if you want to understand kind of how the world works and how we actually fit into it, I would recommend that to anybody. And definitely with the most recent news around the demographic changes in countries like China, in Japan, and even in Russia, and understanding how that's going to impact global trade, which, the pork industry relies extremely heavily on trade for both ingredients and because our product goes so many places across the world. I think that's a great one that everybody should read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. So my last question for you is, if you can think of somebody in your life that you have defined as successful, and you can define that however you'd like, what's a trait that they have possessed that you think has allowed them to be successful?
Yeah. So there's an individual in my life who he is definitely, I call him Dad. But my Uncle Jim is a professor at Baylor College of Medicine, and he's the smartest guy I know. And what I've learned from him is keep searching and keep digging. He's extremely thorough. His patients will say, he took 3 gallons of blood from me today. And what is he going to look for? He's just extremely thorough. Even when it takes time, he does not let the speed of the decision outweigh getting it right. And I think in a world, certainly in a production system where things really click along really fast, I think my dad does a great job of getting that right. And I just look up to him. He takes the time to learn, and I'm very thankful to have his mentorship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a wonderful trait to have, for sure. Well, Kyle, I want to thank you again for your time today. It's been a great conversation around sow longevity. For our audience, again, this is Dr. Kyle Coble, who's the Director of Nutrition Services for JBS. Kyle, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionists.com.